Hi, I'm Faith McInerney, and today we're going to talk about planets on the Venus-Mars midpoint. We've already talked about the Sun equals Venus-Mars. If you're unfamiliar with that picture, go to the YouTube video that says Venus-Mars, and you'll catch up with the meaning of Venus equals Mars, as well as the Sun and other points equals Venus-Mars. But today we're going to talk about the planets, other planets. So we're going to start with Moon equals Venus-Mars, and the symbolism has to do with a female with pronounced sexual energy. It also has to do with beautiful female bodies. This is actually the one picture that may appear, or the one way that it works that may appear in the chart of the actual woman. We're going to talk about that in half a second. Or it has to do with very feminine attributes like dainty, delicate. Now, it often doesn't apply to the sexual activity of the person in whose horoscope it actually appears. However, these two are the exception. The beautiful female body, a woman with Moon equals Venus-Mars, who has a beautiful body, this applies to her, and also the feminine attributes. But more commonly, it applies to another woman or women in the life of the person whose horoscope we're looking at. So, for example, it may be a mother, the person's mother, who's a sexy woman. She likes sex. Or the mother is a MILF. She may be a model. She may be a dancer. Here are some illustrations. This is from my files. A woman with a natal Moon equals Venus-Mars. That's actually incorrect. It should say Venus-Mars. The woman learned that her brother was the result of her mother's affair. She had natal Moon equals Venus-Mars. Here's another illustration where her mother was cast in films as a hot-blooded woman. The daughter had Moon equals Venus-Mars. Lonnie Anderson's mother was a model, although she could certainly qualify as a woman with a beautiful body. But Mariska Hargitay does not have it. Her mother was a sex symbol, but Mariska Hargitay does not have it. Jane Mansfield, on the other hand, had a very prominent Venus-Mars picture in her natal chart. So in terms of women characterized or known for their sexual activity, it can symbolize, Moon equals Venus-Mars can symbolize mistresses, some prostitutes, there are lots of other pictures or some other pictures for prostitution, or a woman who is a sex object. Even some female procurers. This is Ghislaine Maxwell, Moon equals Venus-Mars, and this is Simone de Beauvoir. Venus-Mars equals Aries and the moon. That emphasizes her sexuality. Anything with connects with the Aries point emphasizes it. A different take on Moon equals Venus-Mars is the woman or a woman who founded an organization, Women Against Rape. That was Moon equals Venus-Mars. Of course, there's going to be gay guys with Moon equals Venus-Mars. And here are two illustrations of that. Alfred Douglas, who was the guy who involved Oscar Wilde in a big scandal. Alfred Douglas married a bisexual woman who was in a relationship with another woman, and the woman became godmother to the Douglas's son. He had Moon equals Venus-Mars. Another illustration was a gay man's best friend, who's a woman who has sequential sugar daddies. Mercury equals Venus-Mars. There's an overlap with Mercury-Venus aspects. It'll have to do with a sexual connection with a Mercury person or a person in a Mercury environment. So what are those? Siblings are Mercury people. Education, teachers and pupils are Mercury people and environments, and publications, letters, intimate communication, these are all Mercury manifestations. So in terms of education, Bridget Macron, who had an affair with her student Emmanuel, has Mercury equals, Bridget Macron has Mercury equals Venus-Mars. Emmanuel has Mercury equals Sun-Moon. We're going to actually, which obviously has a similar meaning, if not identical. We're actually going to talk about Venus, Mars, and Sun, Moon a little bit later. Another couple of people who had notorious instances of intimate relationships with students are Mary Kay Letourneau and Jean-Paul Sartre. He was, and another instance of a man who was sexually abused by his teacher and his cousin. These are all Mercury-Venus-Mars people. Now, some of these are kind of famous, not all. Amy Fisher had an affair with her mechanic, and she shot his wife. The fact that she shot his wife is not part of this picture, but that's what if she had just had the affair with the mechanic, she would never have been as notorious as she became when she shot his wife. But anyway, here's the affair with the mechanic, Mercury equals Venus-Mars. Here's another vehicular vehicle way that Mercury equals Venus-Mars worked out. This is a guy who wrote a tell-all book. He was a gas station attendant who serviced celebrities. So they would drive their car in, connect with this gas station attendant, and that's how it worked. Now, he wrote a book and also appeared in publications. What's the word I'm looking for? Recalling these events with celebrities who drove into his gas station and they had sexual connections. And what he had was Venus-Mars equals Jupiter and equals Mercury. Equals Mercury, that's what we're looking for here. Two of the celebrities were Tyrone Power, who also had Jupiter and Mercury on the Venus-Mars midpoint, and Cecil Beaton, who had a more complicated picture, but part of the picture was Venus equals Mercury equals Mars. Saturn was in there also, but this described the gas station guy. Now, Mercury equals Venus-Mars may also describe incest, but that's not as common as having a very highly sexed sibling. And so this is Queen Anne of England, and her husband had 14 illegitimate kids with various mistresses. That's a Randy uncle. Now, these are illustrations of people who wrote books about sex. Here's the Marquis de Sade on the Venus-Mars midpoint. We see his Mercury. Now, I've actually talked about this for a minute in the Venus-Mars video and the other YouTube video. And if you are watching this and haven't seen that, I urge that you see that. It's really an introduction to midpoints. It's an introduction to midpoints. And so a very important point that needs to be made is that you will not get far without using a dial. If you are interested in midpoints, you've already taken the big leap, and the dial is only a small leap further, period. So I strongly suggest, if you do not already use the dial, but you are into midpoints, if you're into midpoints and not yet using the dial, I urge you to at least try it. So here we have the Marquis de Sade with Mercury on the Venus-Mars midpoint. And here we have Rajneesh, also Venus-Mars equals Mercury. And Rajneesh wrote and lectured about sex. It was his thing. He wrote all of these books about sex. And here's the author of 50 Shades of Grey. And she also had a tight Venus-Mars equals Mercury natal picture. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Jupiter equals Venus-Mars, and that has to do with sexual partners who are out of town, who are maybe foreign background, or sexual activity while traveling. And that's what happened with Magic Johnson. He traveled, he was never at a loss for sexual partners, and here we go, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. Heidi Fleiss had an international clientele. Venus, Mars equals Jupiter. There's the Jupiter, and there's the Venus, Mars. Martin Luther King's sexual activity was taped by the FBI while he was traveling. He stayed in hotels, and they wiretapped him, or they tapped his phone. He had also Venus, Mars equals Jupiter. Here are some of these are very amusing examples of Venus, Mars equals Jupiter. This one, not so much, about blackmailing letters from North African men, a French guy getting blackmailing letters from North African men. But this is kind of a hoot. An economist who never left London. His hometown was London. He never left London, but he kept a sex diary with partners, and he named them Swede of the National Gallery, American of Victoria Station, Sculptor of Florence. Never left London, but he met all of these guys and connected with them. Julian Assange became an exile as the result of rape charges in Sweden, and he is not Swedish. This is a slightly different take on it. This is a guy who wasn't having sex with the women. He was a French scientist who subjected a particular African woman called the Hottentot Venus. This was a couple of hundred years ago, by the way. He subjected her to examinations while she was alive and even after she died, and the examinations focused on her genitalia and buttocks. So in other words, he was taken with the sexual characteristics of this Hottentot Venus. And Kate, now, one of the meanings of Jupiter equals Venus, Mars by transit or progression may just be increased sexual energy. And something happened to Kate Blanchett that day, because on a day when transiting Jupiter equaled natal Venus, Mars, she came out. I don't think she's gay, but she came out for some reason, and that was the picture that was in this that hit her chart when it happened. Here's Jupiter equals Venus, Mars in art. A French sculptor this is his most famous sculpture, and it was of a Greek courtesan. Here's Matisse painting a Turkish courtesan. Here's Matisse again with the wife of the king of Crete copulating. And here is Helmut Newton had a series of about international erotica, and this particular one is called the Hotel Milan. He was not Italian, and there you go, Jupiter equals Venus, Mars. Here are some illustrations in literature. This is Aeneas Nin, Jupiter equals Venus, Mars. Randy Expats, you could say, characterizes this book. Lolita, Vladimir Nabokov, had Jupiter equals Venus, Mars. And the content of this book is a European's sexual obsession with an American teenager. This one, I don't know, maybe I tried too hard to fit it in, but Emily Bronte, who never had a personal relationship in her life, no boyfriend, forget lover, nothing, barely left the house. But she wrote Wuthering Heights from her own imagination. She had Scorpio rising and the South Node in Scorpio. So she had a strong sexual imagination, even though there's no record of her even being touched by anybody. At any rate, so when Heathcliff was described in her book, he was described as a dark-skinned gypsy with a little Asian or a little American, or he was a Spanish castaway. And that's how the character in Wuthering Heights, they were a sizzling couple, Kathy and Heathcliff. And this woman who was called Queen of the Paris Lesbians, born in Ohio. And that was a woman with Jupiter equals Venus-Mars. Another illustration I forgot to put in, or whatever, for some reason left out, was that when Steven Spielberg got together with his first wife and they first consummated the relationship, it was in India. They met up in India, they hooked up in India, and then they continued the relationship back home. So we're up to Saturn equals Venus-Mars. And so now we're talking about the opposite of Jupiter. We're talking about impediments, infrequency, or negative consequences. There is some overlap with Chiron equals Venus-Mars. I have so much material on Chiron Venus-Mars, it's going to be its own video at some point. So what causes these problems? It can be a health problem. Here's General Franco. We can see the picture, Saturn on the Venus-Mars midpoint. His doctor concluded that Franco's sex life was non-existent. In fact, there was a simple operation that could have fixed the health problem. Franco refused. He wasn't interested in sex, according to his doctor, although he did have a child. The rationale was that he had the desire for hunger and power outweighed the sexual activity or urge, and he was able to remain celibate, although not entirely. He had a child. So you can have infrequent or be non-sexual for religious reasons. Here is one of the, this is the founder of the Shakers. There are no more Shakers left because they do not have sex. So here's one of the founders. And this is, I did this years ago. I wonder if there are any Shakers left. And this is one of the last 3 living Shakers. Again, there are probably fewer than 3 now. And here was a very ordinary event when I had Saturn to my Venus-Mars one time. I got an obscene phone call. So Saturn equals Venus-Mars can also have to do with prudes. I would think that applied to General Franco as well. And it applied to Queen Victoria's husband, although they had 9 kids, but he apparently had, in his inner circle, he had the reputation of being a prude. That species of vice disgusts me. And from their marriage night onward, Victoria was the aggressor. She had a natal Sun-Mars picture, and he took to cowering behind the locked door of his bedroom. She would bang on the door and, screaming in German, open the door, I'm the queen. And she had Sun equals Mars. She had Sun equals Moon equals Mars. They had a very, very happy relationship, but I'm guessing she brought the Mars energy into it. Banging on the door is Mars equals Sun, Moon. Now, here's another famous relationship that was unconsummated for a very long time. People don't know, but it was unconsummated for 7 years. Unclear as to why. Could have been performance anxiety, a physical problem, could have been just ignorant of what to do. And but apparently it was known by other people and made them the laughing stock. Now, Marie Antoinette, she had the Sun and Saturn equals Venus-Mars. If she just had the Sun equals Venus-Mars, this would have made her an emphasized sexual activity. And she did, just not with her husband so much. But she had Sun equals Saturn equals Venus-Mars, ergo the 7-year unconsummated relationship. He had Chiron equals Venus-Mars. So we see there's an overlap, same situation, Saturn, Venus-Mars with her, Chiron, Venus-Mars with him. Now, interestingly enough, some people with open marriages have Saturn on the Venus-Mars midpoint. Here's Will Smith. Here's Edna St. Vincent Millay, very famous poet whose legacy has been overshadowed by her sexuality and her addictions. So she had a plain old Venus-Mars aspect, which would, again, it emphasizes one's sexual nature when it's a Venus-Mars aspect like this. But by a minor aspect, I'm going to talk about minor aspects, I think, in 1 or 2 slides from now. This is a minor aspect, but note how they're all lined up here. Here's her Venus-Mars aspect that we see on the dial here. And here we see that it's a few minutes away from Chiron, Neptune, she had big addictions, and Saturn. When she met a very important lover in her life, she was on a tour out of town, and she had in her solar return, Jupiter equals Venus-Mars. You see, that works a lot with people traveling, a lot. Back to our material here. So Virginia Woolf had an open marriage. Oh, by the way, Edna St. Vincent Millay, open marriage. Didn't make that clear. But Virginia Woolf, also an open marriage. Now, when she had an important, the most important sexual relationship of her life, in fact, transiting Chiron, triggered her Sun, Saturn, Venus, Mars. So here's transiting Chiron, and here's the Venus, Mars, and here is the, oh God, did I forget to put her Saturn in? No, here it is. Here it is. Sun, Saturn equals Venus, Mars, triggered by Chiron. And interestingly enough, that this relationship, the most important sexual relationship in the life of Virginia Woolf, which began on a Chiron transit, was consummated twice in 6 years. So there you go. Now, Saturn equals Venus Mars is not signification of an open marriage. But my take on why you see it so much is that an open marriage is one solution for an otherwise irresolvable sexual issue between the couple. There are instances of Venus-Mars equals Saturn with unsatisfying sexual partners. Clark Gable was a sex symbol. He had Venus-Mars on the Aries point, but he also had Saturn on the Venus-Mars midpoint, and a quote by his wife, who really loved him. This was a wife who loved him, but apparently said this about him when he was alive. She said it in present tense. I love Pappy, that was her nickname for him, even though he's not the greatest lay. Now, this is a solar fire dial. It's inferior to the dials that we've been looking at and will continue to see. I think I was a little lazy when I did this and I didn't bother to put it on the other program, but I think it's inferior to Nova chart wheels, which is what I usually use, but here it is just for you to see that if you've got solar fire, which is a much more common program than Nova chart wheels, you will be able to access a dial on that program. You can access a dial on just about any astrology program. I'm not familiar with them, but from my understanding, they do come with dials. The irony of Saturn equals Venus-Mars is that 2 of the sexiest men alive, JFK Jr. is no longer alive, but when he was alive, he made the cover of the magazine saying sexiest man alive. JFK Jr. and Bono both have Saturn equals Venus-Mars, kind of ironic. In other words, there's some disparate energy between their external looks and persona versus their private life. Now, in a solar return, and I urge you to use midpoints in your solar returns, this was the solar return for Prince Philip when he was busted for his extramarital sexual activity. If you saw that movie, it was a big part of the movie. He went away on, kind of a boys' vacation on a ship, and everybody just let it all hang out on that vacation. And this was and the news got back to the Queen. That's how he was busted. And Venus-Mars equals Saturn in the solar return. And here's a different manifestation. This was David Carradine, and this was his solar return when he died by autoerotic asphyxiation. Now, by major aspect on the dial, he had Sun equals Venus equals Mars. By the way, that's when the aspect is the strongest, when the three planets that are in a midpoint picture equal each other. So he had Sun equals Venus-Mars. We could tell from that solar return that there was going to be a big deal sexual event in his life that year. And here in his solar return, we see that he had Venus, Mars, Saturn. Now, you cannot see the Saturn was a minor aspect. You cannot see it with this pointer, but you can see it two other ways. You can eyeball it with a little dot. These little dots point out minor aspects. Or you can use my favorite, which is a sort, and it will organize everything that's on a dial in linear order, and it makes it so easy to read. Now, why do I bother with minor aspects, you might wonder? And why you might bother with minor aspects is astrology is a two-step process. You need to understand the delineation, which I'm sure you do by now, and you need to be able to identify the aspect or the midpoint picture whenever it appears in the chart. So certainly not by looking, we don't have his traditional solar return here, but I can assure you, you could not even identify that he had a Venus-Mars aspect in his solar return for that year. We have it in the other video, the Venus-Mars video. But you can see that it's clear on the dial, and this is not as clear, but when you use the sort, and again, if you're going to use the dial, you might as well take the leap to the sort, you see the aspect is crystal clear. And again, when it equals each other, that's when it's the strongest. Uranus equals Venus-Mars. Well, a lot of this is intuitive. It's sexual freedom or sexual activity that ranges from unconventional to bizarre. And in this day, technical elements are really common, such as a partner in science or tech, or sexting, or videos, or vibrators for that matter, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, all of the technical stuff you can possibly use for sexual activity. So here's some instances of sexual freedom. This is Rosa Bonheur. She was an amazing painter in her time, and in fact, remembered, superstar in the art world. And she also was somebody who had Venus equals Mars equals Uranus, nice and plain on a dial. And you can see if you were looking at a traditional chart, you would not see any of this. Pisces, Capricorn, Leo, you would not see any of this in aspect. This is something that you would see on a dial. She wore women's clothes. She got a permit to wear men's clothes because she got a cross-dressing permit because it was illegal. She had to get a permit to do it. Lord Byron, sexual libertine, blatant, unashamed sexuality. The quote about him was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He had a minor aspect of Uranus equals Venus-Mars. He had a wild personal life. It was never ending. He was divorced after 1 year, and his wife publicized his affair with his half-sister. And that resulted in his pressure to leave the country and never return, and he took his sexual antics to the continent. Proust, Marcel Proust, had to change sexual partners every 18 months. He wrote the first French literary work to include same-sex relations. And this illustration is more about the oddball side of Uranus. This was an opera singer. He had Enrico Caruso. He had natal Uranus equals Venus-Mars. and he was convicted of inappropriate behavior. He groped a woman in a monkey house when Jupiter triggered the picture. He had, and here is Jupiter triggering his Venus-Mars-Uranus picture. He also had very complicated marriages and divorces. So here we go. This is super common in this day and age where technology will play a role in one's sexual life when you have natal Uranus equals Venus-Mars. So here is Linda Tripp. With her, she had this super wide midpoint picture. I would never in this lifetime consider 1.5 degrees for a midpoint picture. However, she lived long enough where progressed Uranus triggered off her Venus-Mars midpoint to the minute. And she handed over the recorded conversations about Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. Lewinsky took her into her confidence, badly placed confidence, and Linda Tripp handed them over to a federal prosecutor, and all of that resulted in Clinton's impeachment. Here is a more recent one, and not really recent, but anyway, recent enough, Anthony Weiner, and we have a picture of him sexting. Here, not only did we know he sexted, but we have a picture of him doing it. And he did not, oh yeah, he had the natal picture with the transit happening. I didn't write the transit in here, but transiting Uranus, let's see, this would have happened when Uranus was 25 Aries. So that times it for us. Oh, I beg your pardon. It would have happened when Uranus was 26 Aries. So transiting Uranus was on his Venus. This is Taya Leone. Her marriage ended after she found explicit texts on her phone. She had natal Saturn and Uranus on the Venus-Mars midpoint. Here's the Venus-Mars midpoint, and there's natal Saturn and Uranus. And transiting Saturn and Uranus, they were connected by aspect in the sky. So it triggered on that transiting picture, triggered off her natal picture of Saturn, Uranus, Venus. So that was that setup. And here is the pertinent part of the chart of Shi Pipu. She was the lover of M. Butterfly, the bizarre love story, the bizarre story of a love affair between a young French man and his Chinese mistress, and they even parented a child. And then the strange truth came out that Shi Pipu was not a woman. Sun equals Venus-Mars, emphasizes the sexuality. Uranus on Venus-Mars, the oddball or unconventional or strange aspect of it came out. So here we have Neptune equals Venus-Mars. Again, a lot of this is intuitive. The RPP, the rules for planetary pictures, says that Neptune equals Venus-Mars, secret sexual inclinations. So you see secret sex relationships, mysterious sexual situations, like people who get pregnant or have a child where the fatherhood is in question, unknown, mysterious. Sex dreams and sex fantasies, that's intuitive. This is quite literal, sex in water, sex with people in the Navy. Some incidents of spirituality and sex, not always consummated because it's so spiritual. Health issues may affect sexual activity, and also where sex happens in the context of drugs or alcohol, not necessarily Viagra, but there's one instance where it did. Okay, so talk about lack of clarity. We just talked about this, where this is the French guy who met Shi Pipu, who thought she was a woman. And that mistake or illusion lasted for a long time. Now, he had natal Neptune on the Venus-Mars midpoint. Isn't that interesting? Same situation, the two partners in the same situation. For one, it was described by Uranus. For the other, it was described by Neptune. Well, this guy was in the dark. It was a more Neptunian situation. And in fact, when they met, Neptune in Scorpio was squaring his sun. So there we have Neptune equals Venus-Mars. What else do we have here? Oh, these were the dots. In other words, the minor aspects. He also had Venus equals Mars equals Saturn, and also equal Juno. Actually, we're not going to go into the asteroids today. For some reason, I didn't exclude that. Here are some mysterious situations, some more mysterious situations with Neptune equals Venus-Mars. So with the secrets, lies, lack of clarity. So here's Mary, Queen of Scots. And the question, even hundreds of years later, was she raped or did she consent to sex with a man who eventually became her husband? So whether she was his accomplice, again, they eventually married, whether she was his accomplice or a willing victim remains a controversial issue. And this was the solar return when she hid the motivation. Here was the transit. Transiting Uranus was on her Venus-Mars midpoint when the event happened. And by the way, she had natal Saturn in Scorpio. Again, look at the first Venus-Mars video and you'll see delineations even for Saturn in Scorpio and sexuality. It emphasizes it. Shaquille O'Neal apologizes for lying about sexual partners. Now, here's a guy who had many of them, and with Saturn on the Venus-Mars midpoint, but when he apologized for lying, it was the transit of Neptune and Saturn that triggered it off. I don't know what motivated him. I'm sure he wouldn't have admitted it and apologized for it if he was not motivated by something. Here we see some illustrations of Neptune's association with health, drugs, and alcohol. First, drugs. So this was Sean Penn met El Chapo and had a sexual relationship with the woman who facilitated their meeting. It happened somewhere between, the affair lasted between 2015 and 2016. Here is the lunar return for when they met. Now here, the important part is the Neptune probably symbolizes El Chapo here, El Chapo. It's possible they themselves were drinking or drugging, but I'm guessing it had to do with the woman's connection with El Chapo. And here is the solar return for that meeting, where Neptune was on the Venus-Mars midpoint, less than a degree. This is about 3/4, 45, maybe a little bit less than 45 minutes. And what do we want to talk about here? Who is he? I'm guessing this is Sean Penn, has Venus-Mars equals Neptune. I didn't label that properly well enough, but I'm guessing that this is Sean Penn's natal chart. More about Neptune's association with health, drugs, and alcohol. Marquis de Sade. This is his natal chart. He was sentenced to death for drugging prostitutes, and he had Neptune equals Venus-Mars. And this was his solar return with a different picture here where Venus-Mars is part of it, but Neptune, it's kind of Neptune-Chiron equals Venus-Mars. Here we have Madonna. This is a lunar return where she got drunk on stage and begged somebody to come up and have sex with her. And this is what she looked like. And this was the picture. She had in her lunar return, Neptune equals Venus-Mars. Incidentally, she has the natal minor aspect. So the partner's health might be a factor. Sort of true with Edgar Allan Poe. He had an unconsummated marriage. He sort of falls into the spiritual way that Venus-Mars equals Neptune can manifest. Unconsummated marriage. They shared a bed, but only till she got sick. And then he watched her die while she was in bed. And it manifested, that look of her dying in bed manifested itself in his stories. But this is much more exact manifestation of the Venus-Mars equals Neptune. His alcoholism got in the way of a relationship. He tried to remarry, and then the woman, by the way, was also tubercular. She was also ill and also died young, like his wife. But she agreed to marry him only if he would stop drinking, but he could not. So we see a few ways that it works with him: being attracted to sick women, apparently, spiritual relationship rather than really sexual relationship. Oh, and alcohol. So the health, drugs, or alcohol issues can be your own or the partner's. This is Florence Nightingale, who had Venus-Mars equals Neptune. And they named a whole syndrome after her, the Florence Nightingale effect, where caregivers develop a romantic or sexual feeling for their patients. I have to guess this actually happened to her at some point, or they wouldn't have necessarily named it that, I'm guessing. So here's Keith Haring when progressed Neptune triggered his natal Venus-Mars by 3 minutes orb. He was diagnosed with AIDS. And when Hugh Hefner had a stroke, he had progressed Neptune equals Venus-Mars. We don't know what he was doing when he had the stroke, but I can infer something, but I think you can probably infer it too, but I don't know. It would be speculation. But what he said was, this stroke will change the nature and focus of my life. And when it was exact, he got married, he closed the Playboy clubs, he gave up recreational drugs, and by the way, he took Viagra and it made him deaf. Now, Neptune and water. This is actually one of the most interesting slides in this presentation. It is so literal. So here's Mark Twain. He was on a ship. He saw a picture of his future wife. He fell in love with the picture. And then obviously he married her. It was his future wife. Ongoing, he was attracted to young girls. He called them angelfish. He wrote them passionate letters, but there was no evidence of sexual activity. Now here, we can see that he didn't just have Venus-Mars equals Neptune, which describes the context of the sexual activity. Here we see his highly sexed nature, because he had 3 out of the list of maybe 5 or 6 horoscope placements that have to do with increased sexual activity, or where sexual activity is more in the forefront of their lives. So he had Saturn, and he had Scorpio rising, he had Saturn in Scorpio, and he had the South Node in Scorpio. So that was kind of a trifecta of pictures for sexual activity. And yet he was not really known that way. None of his books reflect it. Really, I had to go digging for what it meant that he had Neptune equals Venus-Mars. But there you go. Now here's a woman who was born one day earlier. So she didn't have Scorpio rising, but she also had Saturn and the South Node in Scorpio, which is sufficient. She was a Chinese empress, and she was allegedly serviced in the bath by a eunuch. Chinese people, they say it's impossible. There's unshakable customs. No way that that happened. However, somebody explained it this way, and it makes a lot of sense, that the eunuch had mastered a special combing and hairdressing technique, and the only way that the empress would stay with him was after, this is the only way that the empress would stay with him was after bathing. So she would take a bath. I actually thought it was in the bath, but anyway, she would take a bath, and then he would do his special combing and hairdressing technique. These are also literal, sex and water. This is an artist who had no personal life, zero personal life. He had Neptune equals Venus-Mars equals Aries. This is also common with us, emphasize Venus-Mars, where they're celibate. So he did paintings of naked male bathers and fishermen, Neptune equals Venus-Mars. Here is Turner, who is known for paintings of water and but no sex in the paintings. But in real life, he met a woman by the seashore. He assumed her name. He was incognito. He assumed her name. He assumed a title. Her name was Booth. He became Admiral Booth. He had period. He had an affair with his housekeeper who had a disfiguring skin condition. And there were some secrets and mystery around his sexual stuff. He had Venus-Mars, and he apparently did a lot of erotic work, drawings and maybe something else, but it was burned by John Ruskin, the critic. And here, so they're lost. So here we have his Venus-Mars aspect and the aspect to Neptune. As you would imagine, sex dreams and fantasy would seem to be an important manifestation of Neptune equals Venus-Mars, but because they are dreams and fantasy, they are really only available through people who choose to admit them. And these are authors who exhibited their Neptune equals Venus-Mars in their books, conscious or unconscious. So here's another guy who never had a relationship, the author Nicholas Gogol. His stories, and this is what was said about his stories, that they're an artistic realization of a pre-pubertal boy's fantasy. But the references all refer to Neptune equals Venus-Mars. So, for example, a chaste man follows a prostitute into a brothel. He then takes opium so he can go to sleep and dream of her as being wealthy and chaste. Here's another book. Frequently in his dreams, he beheld her, flitted constantly her elastic bosom. That was a dream. Another book included a father-daughter incest dream. And another book included an unhinged sexual fantasy. And still another book had sex with a mermaid. This was the illustration. Pluto equals Venus-Mars. Very commonly, financial resources and the sexual partner. Some instances of palimony. Very high incidence of marrying somebody wealthy or connected with the financial world. This would be the same for Pluto equals Sun Moon. There is, particularly when I did Pluto on Venus-Mars, there was an incredibly high incidence of interchangeability of Pluto Sun Moon. In other words, the same picture, Pluto equals Venus-Mars, would have also applied to people who had Pluto equals Sun Moon. So here's Clint Eastwood. He had natal Pluto equals Pallas equals Venus-Mars. We're not really doing the asteroids today, but just one little tidbit. about polis. It has to do with work, with practical kinds of situations. And people who have polis equals Venus-Mars can work in the sex industry or have sex with people they work with. And that was true of Clint Eastwood. They met on a movie. So he has Venus-Mars equals Pluto. And when the palimony suit happened, he had Venus-Mars solar arc Pluto. Let's look at that. He had Venus-Mars, and here's the solar arc with natal Pluto. And when he was sued for child support by a former sex partner, both natal and progressed Pluto equaled Venus-Mars by 3. No, I'm sorry. He had natal Venus-Mars equals Pluto, but progressed Pluto equaled Venus-Mars by 3 minutes when he was sued for child support by a former sexual partner. More resources in an intimate relationship, like a wealthy romantic partner. So this guy found himself rich for the first time when he had an affair with a wealthy gallery owner. Transiting Pluto was 1 degree from the midpoint. He had the natal midpoint, Pluto equals Venus-Mars, and you see transiting Pluto triggered it off. And months later, that transit was still happening. Transiting Pluto is, it's a slow-moving planet. And he met another rich woman who became his wife, and she was described as well-off and generous. Now, I don't understand why there is such a strong interchangeability of Pluto equals Sun, Moon, and Pluto equals Venus-Mars. All I can say is that it exists again and again and again. So here is Albrecht Dürer, whose father arranged for him to marry a rich woman. It happened when progressed Pluto was 3 minutes from the Venus-Mars midpoint. He had the natal picture, and the progression hit it exactly. And here's an engraving that he did, Marriage and Money. Here is Queen Mary of France. So what happened to her was she married a guy her father did not approve of. And so when she married against the king's wishes, she had to pay a big fine. And what happened was she had natal Saturn and Pluto equals Venus-Mars, and transiting Saturn and Pluto in the sky triggered off her identical natal picture. And so she paid a big fine. Here's a woman who successfully sued her husband for the restoration of her conjugal rights. She won. She successfully sued her husband for conjugal rights. And here she has the Venus-Mars midpoint equals Pluto, with transiting Pluto triggering the picture. It's very uncommon that Pluto equals Venus-Mars will have to do with death, but it happens, and here are some illustrations. So this is Jim Carrey, who was charged with wrongful death because he purposely hid results. So let's talk about that first. He had Neptune equals Venus-Mars. He had a sexually transmitted disease, and he hid it. He wasn't upfront about it. So she developed an STD and committed suicide. And in his solar return, I don't know where she was from, but in his solar return, the suicide showed up as Venus equals Mars equals Jupiter equals Pluto equals node. And that was his solar return picture. I urge you to use your solar returns with these midpoint pictures. They're pretty mind-blowing. Now, here we have an incident that's famous in history. It was in a movie. The movie might even be called the Meyerling incident. So there was a prince who proposed a double suicide to a courtesan. She said no, And he was dead set. He proposed a death pact with his 17-year-old mistress, and she accepted. This was the solar return. It's a variation. He had, first of all, he had Venus-Mars emphasized. This actually would have been Venus-Mars on the Aries point, so sex was emphasized. And it was on the Sun-Pluto midpoint. His widow, because these were all mistresses, his widow, because he was married, had natal Pluto equals Venus-Mars. And her husband committed suicide with his mistress. Now, here's something that happened in our history, in US history. This was Joseph McCarthy, who's actually famous for outing communists, or supposed alleged communists in the 50s. And he was a bad guy. He threatened to use a senator's gay son's arrest against him, and it caused the senator to commit suicide. That's what happened. Now, here's the astrology of it. In his natal chart, he had Venus-Mars equals Sun and Pluto. In his solar return, he had Pluto equals Venus-Mars. Here's the natal chart of the guy who committed suicide. He had Uranus equals Venus-Mars, even though this was not about his own sex life, it was about his son. And when he committed suicide, so he did not have Pluto, he had Saturn and Venus on the Venus-Mars midpoint. He also had, if you'll notice, Saturn equals Uranus, which is that's a range of problematic of problematic events. It can be an argument, it can be an accident. In very rare cases, it's a death. That's the extreme end of it. Very uncommon, does happen. And I love this, Lena Wertmuller, Pluto equals Venus-Mars. A lot of her movies have references to it. Sex between rich people and poor people. Sex connected with murder. I think this one was that. A guy stays in a brothel while preparing to assassinate Mussolini. And survival through sexual favors. A POW survives with sexual favors. And this is actually her famous one, Swept Away. And this is about a rich capitalist woman's belief and her employees' communist convictions clash. But as you can see, they wind up working it out while they were shipwrecked. In art, we see relationships combined with money and jealousy and revenge and sometimes death, all the Pluto issues. Here's an opera where of a guy who had Pluto equals Venus-Mars, and the synopsis is a guy comes back from military. His fiance married somebody rich. He revenges. He seduces another woman. Overcome by jealousy, his ex-fiance begins an adulterous affair with him, and it results in his murder. So we see a wacky combination of the whole thing: the money, the jealousy, the revenge, and the death. Here is Marguerite Duras' novel, The Lover, about a girl from a financially strapped family who the family push her into a relationship with a wealthy guy. Now, there is some incidence of police with Pluto equals Venus-Mars. When Modigliani, who did not have Pluto equals Venus-Mars, but who had transiting Venus, up in the sky, there was transiting Venus, transiting Uranus, and transiting Pluto, all equal his Venus-Mars midpoint. Here's his Venus-Mars midpoint. These would be the transits. I can't read these. I should have blown this up. So this is either one of these three planets is Pluto, and the other two are Venus and Uranus. And in his solar return, he also had Pluto equals Venus-Mars. Incidentally, no natal aspect. These are less likely manifestations, blackmail and revenge. Here's somebody who was, they attempted to blackmail her with transiting Pluto on her Venus-Mars midpoint. They were going to expose that she had 3 ways with prostitutes and bestiality and STDs. This was all fake. Rich Little was sued for secretly videotaping sex. And these are assorted consequences where there was a disclosure that her anal cancer was HPV related. Now, again, we're back to the less likely manifestation of police being involved in one's sexual life. This is a guy who really is not as remembered as he should be. He was a huge figure in the history of gay rights and decriminalization in the 50s. And it began with his arrest. The quote was, "The conspiracy to incite certain male persons to commit serious offenses with male persons." Natally, he had Venus-Mars equal Pluto, equals Uranus, equals node. And when transiting Pluto triggered the picture, he was arrested. And that got the whole ball rolling. He wrote a book about it. It exploded. And eventually, he was instrumental. I mean, you could say he was central in having the law changed, which didn't happen for another few years. It happened in 1967, where in Britain, homosexuality was decriminalized. This is the guy, Peter Wildeblood. People owe him a giant debt of gratitude. Brave guy. And here is a picture. This is Julian Assange's lunar return when he was accused of rape. Pluto equals Venus-Mars. Just a couple of words about the node equals Venus-Mars. It has to do with non-exclusive sexual relationships. It appeared in the natal chart of a man who had 3,000 sexual partners over his life, and it appears in solar and lunar returns where there's a triangle. Angelina Jolie's solar return when she connected with Brad Pitt, John Edwards' solar return when he met the woman who involved him in a sex scandal, and Woody Allen's lunar return when the affair with Soon Yi began. Now, this is a very useful midpoint in solar returns and lunar returns, particularly for clients who have married boyfriends who, I don't know why I'm thinking these are all women, but clients who have relationships with married people or relationships with people who are themselves non-exclusive. Because when you look down the pike at a solar return a year and 2 years from now and see that the node is on Venus-Mars, you can assess this relationship will continue to be non-exclusive. This is me. I'm Faith McInerney. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see some more of my work, you can go to one of these addresses to see the Midpoint Observatory, or you can email me. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.